Let's step into this room together. 20 of America's finest doctors had just shaken their heads. I heard them say it. There is nothing more we can do. Charlotte Sinclair, billionaire, completely untouchable. This woman who never lost was dying right there. Alarms were blaring while her family just stood paralyzed. And then me, a guy in a faded uniform. Still holding my mop, I spoke up quietly. Excuse me, but her hands, that isn't a neurological tremor. Every single head snapped my way, wondering who I thought I was. Then I said the next part, and everything went completely still. That woman was Charlotte Sinclair, 38 years old and head of Sinclair Capital Group. It was a massive investment firm reaching across 6 continents, touching pretty much every part of our economy. I had seen her face on plenty of financial magazines. Politicians in Washington always quoted her when talking about policy. For 15 brutal years, she had built up a legacy, a rock-solid reputation as someone who simply never lost. She did not drop negotiations. She never lost an argument. She absolutely never let herself lose control of a situation. But right now, the machines above her bed were shrieking in short, frantic bursts. I watched her fingers twitch against the bright white sheets. Small, steady tremors. Her breathing was way too fast and entirely too shallow. Like her body was trying to outrun some invisible force, tightening around her throat. I saw her family standing just outside the glass. Her brother Alexander looked ghost white, pressing his hands hard against his legs just to keep himself on his feet. 2 of her executives were in the hall. Their phones were actually dark, staring blankly at the wall. Then, cutting through that total silence, came a sound. The slow, wet drag of my mop on linoleum. It is the sound of early mornings, empty halls, and the quiet work of folks like me that nobody ever notices. That was me in the faded gray uniform, pushing my bucket to a stop right outside her room. I guess I always looked like a guy who learned how to stay invisible. It was not because I was shy, but pure habit. After years cleaning hospital rooms, you get used to breathing air thick with other people's pain. I casually glanced through the observation window. My eyes locked right onto her hands. I stood there watching for a second. Then I finally spoke up, "Excuse me," low and unhurried. "But her hands, the way they are moving. I don't think that is the tremor you're treating." Every single head in that room turned. And the stares they gave me were not exactly curious. They were the cold, annoyed glares of important people who never get interrupted by a guy holding a mop. Until I said the next part. Now watch how everything went completely silent. You see, Charlotte Sinclair never planned on being in here. She planned for a typical morning board meeting, just like she controlled everything else. A flight to London that evening, making a string of choices as perfectly as a ticking clock. But she definitely had not planned for the violent trembling starting in her left hand just 3 days before coming in, or that sudden wave of disorientation hitting her mid-conference call, or the moment her assistant found her gripping the desk edge with both hands, just staring blankly at the wall, like it had asked her some impossible question she couldn't answer. Word was, Charlotte fought going in. To her, hospitals meant surrendering control. And letting go of control, she refused to do that gracefully. But her symptoms got worse every single hour. The shaking just deepened. Her sharp billionaire mind was getting foggy. Her heart skipping its rhythm in weird ways she couldn't even explain. Alexander finally stopped arguing and just called the ambulance for her himself. Now you and I both know places like Hargrove Private Medical Center. Ordinary folks never actually enter. The lobby felt like a hushed, marble-floored luxury 5-star hotel. Every local university hospital completely envied their incredible patient-to-specialist care ratio. When whispers started that billionaire Charlotte Sinclair arrived with a mystery neurological crisis, the center's top chief of medicine, Dr. William Hayes, pulled together an emergency panel within the hour. 20 different top-tier physicians took their seats around this massive, mahogany conference table. Neurologists, cardiologists, even a Boston toxicologist they flew in. Some immunologist with huge cases cited across 3 different medical journals. Dr. Hayes sat right at the head of the table and laid out data with the smug precision of a guy who never once doubted his own competence. Me, I'd been working the floors at Hargrove for 11 months. I was 33 but looked a lot older, working night shifts as a single dad ages a guy. Not totally weathered, just heavily weighted. Like some invisible heavy pressure permanently settled right across my shoulders. I kept quiet, sure, but my dark eyes missed absolutely nothing happening around me. The guys liked me fine, my supervisors always called me reliable. But nobody ever bothered asking about my life before the mop and gray uniform. But stick with me here. Here is what nobody at Hargrove ever realized. Was that I spent 6 whole years working as a biomedical equipment tech at a regional hospital out in western Pennsylvania. I personally calibrated ventilators, fixed imaging machines, and tested surgical suite gas systems. I even earned my clinical engineering certification before my daughter was born. Once I planned to go further, complete a master's degree, move right into medical device design. That was before Emily came along. Emily is 6 now, and she's the absolute center of my entire world. She's got her mom's smile and my dark eyes, and a laugh that clears a terrible day like wind blowing away smoke. But she was born with this mild, persistent sensitivity in her little airways. Nothing completely catastrophic. Nothing needing constant emergency hospital intervention. But it demanded real care. It made me pay extreme attention to the air she breathed and the spaces she occupied. I left my tech career 2 years ago. Juggling Emily's health and rotating hospital shifts made it completely impossible to do either job properly. So I took this janitorial position. I took this hospital job for the steady hours and the solid health insurance. On the rougher mornings, I promised myself it was just a temporary gig. Still telling myself that today, the medical panel spent 9 hours scrambling Dr. Hayes kicked things off with the Billionaire scans, clean MRI, 0 lesions. They saw absolutely nothing physical to explain her violent shaking or the mental fog. Some hotshot neurologist from Johns Hopkins stared at her brainwaves, ambiguous he called it. The toxicology guy ran every poison test under the sun, came up totally empty. Then the immune expert guessed it was some super rare, rapid-fire disease acting exactly like a total brain shutdown. They chased that ghost for 2 hours before her blood tests proved them wrong again. They pumped in new drugs, tweaked her IV fluids. They ordered another whole round of scans. They even flew in some big-deal specialist for rare tremors. The guy who literally wrote the textbook on the illness sat next to Charlotte's bed for 40 straight minutes. He just stared at her, shaking hands, walked into the boardroom and muttered, looking like a man dodging a bullet, "I have absolutely no idea what we are dealing with here." But Charlotte's mysterious illness was not waiting around for their fancy debates. Those shakes, which started out so small and quiet, were getting violently worse, hitting her in these heavy waves, crashing through her fingers and traveling up her arms. Her heart monitor was jumping all over the place, made 0 logical sense. It wasn't the normal stutter of a classic heart attack. It was chaotic and messy, like a radio catching bad static. Meanwhile, her oxygen numbers stayed perfectly normal. Her blood pressure dropped a bit, but nothing too scary. On paper, she looked almost fine, and you and I know that's the deadliest answer possible. By the time hour number 9 rolled around, Dr. Hayes faced his team and admitted what everybody in that room already knew. We are completely out of standard medical options for her. We're out of the weird ones, too. He stopped talking. This guy never stopped talking. We need to prep her family for the worst. Not a single doctor pushed back. The dead air in that room wasn't agreement. It was the heavy weight of pure total burnout. That specific, hollow feeling that chokes out a room when geniuses try every trick in the book and still slam face first into a brick wall. Half of them would drive home tonight and stare at the bedroom ceiling. Others would dig through the Billionaire's chart tomorrow, running the exact same useless tests all over again, praying to spot whatever tiny clue their combined genius had somehow managed to overlook. But in that room, not a single one of them expected a miracle. Stick with me here. I was mopping the 4th floor corridor when their big meeting ended. I always worked the same way, moving room to room, never rushing, never dragging my feet, just quiet, steady, and watching. I caught their voices first, that tight, low, fake calm tone experts use when they're hiding sheer panic from the rest of us. I parked my cleaning cart by the intensive care doors and listened. I wasn't just being nosy. It's my instinct, the exact same gut feeling that tells me when a boiler is running half a beat off its normal rhythm. Through that thick hospital glass, I zeroed in on her trembling hands. I stood there for a long while. I wasn't formally checking off symptoms for this mysterious illness. I was just watching. You learn a lot that way, don't you? I once helplessly watched someone I love fight for air in a hospital room that was supposed to be completely safe. Her tremors moved in a rhythm, but nothing strictly neurological. I knew exactly what that looked like. I had seen it for years while cleaning around clinical equipment. This shaking was much subtler, cyclical, almost tidal. When the overhead light hit her face, her lips carried just the faintest shadow of blue along the edges. The slow rise and fall of the bedsheet showed her breathing. It was slightly out of sync with the heart monitor's pulse reading. Right then, something just clicked into place in my mind. I pushed my cleaning cart aside and stepped into the open doorway. The attending nurse looked over with total professional boredom. Dr. Hayes was talking near the window. I cleared my throat. Excuse me, I spoke up. Her hands, the way they keep moving, I really don't think that's the tremor you're treating. Dr. Hayes turned around slowly. He stared at me like I was something blurry that he just could not bring into focus. Excuse me, her hands. I kept my voice perfectly steady. The pattern, it is not dyskinetic, it is cyclical. And her lips are showing a very slight discoloration. I think you might be missing a microhypoxia event. A heavy silence fell. Who are you? Dr. Hayes asked. James Carter, I do environmental services. A resident by the door scoffed. You and I both know the type, not quite a laugh, but the same insult. The attending nurse just pressed her lips tight. A top cardiologist who flew in from Atlanta that morning went right back to his notepad. The move felt as final as slamming a door shut. Doctor. Hayes studied me for a second, wearing the tired face of a guy who has to deal with a ridiculous claim he really wants to ignore completely. Mr. Carter, he said, using the tight patience of a man barely hiding his deep annoyance. We have 20 of the absolute best doctors in the country working on this billionaire's case. I do appreciate your genuine concern, but I assure you her oxygen saturation is being monitored around the clock. It is sitting within normal parameters. I know, I told him. But where exactly are you measuring it? Another pause, even longer now. Her fingertip, the nurse chimed in, sounding pretty defensive. Standard placement. I looked right back down at Charlotte's hands. Her fingers were shaking, a constant, endless trembling, with just enough motion to constantly mess up the contact of a standard pulse oximeter clip. If that sensor loses contact randomly, I said, you might be getting a reading that's only true half the time. The resident by the door stood a little straighter. The nurse's face shifted, but not quite to agreement. Not yet, but you could see she wasn't dismissing me anymore. Dr. Hayes didn't move an inch. That is a massive claim to make, he said. I know it is, I answered. I also think you really need to check the ventilation system in this room. I felt the heavy silence in that room shift completely. I'd watched the billionaire patient's trembling hands for 10 minutes, but I was also scanning the room. This hospital ICU was climate-controlled, sealed tight to stop infections. But what definitely wasn't standard, at least in my experience, was the weak, barely noticeable stutter in the airflow from the ceiling vent right above her. A phantom flutter. You'd never catch it unless you had spent literal decades listening to the way buildings breathe. And I've spent my whole life listening to systems breathe. When Emily got sick, I blurted out. I froze, not meaning to say my daughter's name aloud. I cleared my throat. 2 years ago, my daughter had these exact symptoms. Intermittent and cyclical. Her oxygen readings looked totally fine on the standard monitors. But her room had a tiny carbon monoxide leak. It was too slow to trip any safety detectors. Not enough for acute poisoning, but enough to silently starve her brain over hours. Enough to scramble her nervous system, enough to make her hands tremble. I stared down at Charlotte. She isn't sick, I told them. She's being slowly poisoned by this very room. The young medical resident stepped forward. That would mean a massive failure in the— I know, I interrupted. But it answers everything you top doctors haven't been able to explain. Dr. Hayes went absolutely dead still. For a second, the room suffocated under that heavy tension. The feeling when the smartest guy present is told by a janitor he might be completely wrong. It was a brutally uncomfortable silence, Dr. Hayes had built his entire career on being right. Not arrogantly right, but carefully, meticulously right. He had the medical journals to prove it. He had the board. He had 9 hours of pure collective expertise, Mr. Carter, he said slowly. What you're suggesting means we'd have to move Miss Sinclair. Moving her in this fragile state carries. I know the risks, I shot back. But I also know if I'm right and you stall, the window to save her slams shut. Dr. Hayes just stared at me for a long time. Then he glanced down at Charlotte. Finally, his eyes drifted up to the vent above her. Get building facilities on the line, he ordered. He spoke to the nurse, all that rigid certainty completely gone. And bring me a portable arterial blood gas testing unit. We're going to test his theory, but it was Alexander Reed making the final call. Her brother had been standing out there, watching us through the glass, tracking a tense argument he could see but couldn't hear, reading the posture of 20 top doctors and one janitor with the desperate intensity of a guy whose sister was fading fast. When the nurse stepped out to explain the situation, all sanitized and professional, carefully worded, Alexander listened without interrupting. When she finally finished, he stayed quiet for a second. What does the janitor think? He asked. The nurse stalled. Mr. Carter thinks we need to get Miss Sinclair to another room right this second, and that this entire ICU ventilation system needs immediate inspection. I watched Alexander staring at his sister through the glass. Her hands twitched against the sheets in those tiny, steady, rhythmic tremors. The monitors beeped their frantic, broken music. Do it, he ordered. The nurse hesitated. Mr. Reed, the risk of moving her right now. I heard the risk, he snapped. Move her. The transport took exactly 4 minutes. They pushed Charlotte to a recovery suite 2 floors higher, carefully tracking her struggling vitals every single step. I walked right alongside that medical team, not because anybody asked me to, but simply because nobody even thought to tell me to stop, and because I just could not bring myself to go back to my mop. The attending doctor moved in sharp silence. Those monitors kept beeping their traveling rhythm. Nobody said a word, because there was nothing left to argue. The choice was already made. Now only the result remained. You and I both know that feeling, waiting for the coin to finally land. The shift was not instant, but it was absolutely real. Within 20 minutes of swapping rooms, the violent shaking in Charlotte's hands started fading. Not totally gone, but easing up, like releasing a breath you held forever. Her struggling heart rate, which had been performing its erratic, shifting dance for hours, finally settled into a much more recognizable rhythm. Her color crept back slowly, warmth flooding her face, like that old hospital room had literally been suffocating her. Dr. Hayes stood near her new bed, just watching those critical care monitors normalize. He did not say a single word for ages. The maintenance crew reached her original ICU room within the hour. What they discovered was tiny, just practically invisible. Let's look at the real issue here. A microfracture in a secondary gas line. Totally invisible to normal checks, leaking so incredibly slowly that the building's smart sensors caught absolutely nothing. That sealed intensive care room, built to shield fragile patients from outside germs, had instead locked the poison inside. For Charlotte, trapped inside that specific room for 36 straight hours, it was like breathing air that felt perfectly safe to everyone else. Just a tiny fraction below the danger threshold any qualified doctor would ever think to measure. The building manager stood out in the corridor and repeated phrases like microfracture, sealed environment, and entirely undetectable by standard protocols to literally anyone listening. He spoke with the desperate look of a guy wanting those technical terms to sound like an explanation instead of a guilty confession. Dr. Hayes walked straight to where I stood outside the suite, still wearing my janitor uniform. With my cart parked against the wall, he stopped right before me. The leak was officially confirmed, Dr. Hayes told me. A tiny fractional carbon monoxide seepage. The pulse oximeter was fooled by her tremor pattern, exactly as you described it. He paused. Our medical board, myself included, lacked any framework for these combined factors. We were searching for a disease. There wasn't one, I told him. No, Dr. Hayes admitted, there wasn't. A heavy silence passed between us. You have a clinical background, Dr. Hayes noted. It was not a question. I did, I answered. Biomedical equipment, 6 years. Why did you leave? I just stared toward the window, at the end of the hallway. Look, we have all seen it. The city evening settling in, the sky shifting orange to deep blue. My little girl needed me somewhere entirely predictable. I told him rotating shifts and medical emergencies just don't work for a single dad. Dr. Hayes nodded. He asked about the carbon monoxide incident I had mentioned earlier. Old rental house, I explained. Cracked heat exchanger in the basement furnace. The cheap hallway detector completely missed it. Missed it because the leak was right inside her bedroom. She was only 5. She had that exact same look Charlotte did, not obviously dying, just slowly fading away. 3 days. Doctors called it a virus until I finally tore the walls open myself. I said it without any bitterness. I have had years to make my peace with those terrifying 3 days. I wasn't smart enough to diagnose her, I said, just angry enough to keep looking. Hayes went quiet. Then he muttered, "That distinction actually matters a lot less than you'd think." Charlotte woke around 11 that night. The VIP suite was completely silent. One single lamp burned softly near the window. The medical monitors beside her bed were finally dialed to low alert. She was stable now, genuinely, truly stable. Her vitals settling into the steady rhythm of a body that was terrified but totally unbroken. I watched her lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece the blur of yesterday into something that made sense. When she finally turned her head, she noticed me. I was sitting by the door in my work clothes, elbows resting heavy on my knees. I was staring at the floor tiles, not out of pure exhaustion, not exactly anyway. More like that very specific kind of stillness you learn. You and I know that hospital stillness. You wait without letting your anxiety choke the room's air. You're the one who figured it out. Charlotte whispered. Her voice was rough. She cleared her throat, and that struggle made the billionaire look completely ordinary for once. She clearly wasn't used to feeling so ordinary. I looked back up. I kept my eyes perfectly calm, not the kind of calm that begs for a reward. Not some rehearsed performance either. Just the quietness of a guy who didn't need this whole moment blown out of proportion. I recognized a pattern, I told her. 20 specialists didn't. They were hunting for some rare disease they had never seen before. I was looking for something I had. She studied my face. She was excellent at reading people. She built her massive fortune on reading folks fast and getting it right every single time. But what did she see in me? Something you and I know she rarely encounters. No ambition, no blind respect. Not the sneaky calculation of a guy figuring out how much cash this moment was worth. Just an observant guy who did the obvious thing, feeling pretty awkward being stared at for it. "Thank you," she said. I gave her one small nod, accepting her gratitude without letting it weigh me down too heavily. Then I stood up, grabbed my work jacket off the chair, and told her, "You should really sleep. Your color's better now, but you lost a lot of hours." I was halfway out the door when she asked, "What is your name?" I turned around, "James Carter." "You learn a lot watching people." She locked my name away like meeting numbers, knowing she'd definitely need me later. "Get some rest, Mr. Carter," she said. "You too," I told her. The fallout was incredibly fast. 3 days after her discharge, Charlotte demanded a massive infrastructure audit of Hargrove Private Medical Center. Not just some useless compliance audit that gathers dust inside a desk drawer somewhere. We're talking physical upgrades, overseen by independent engineers who owed zero favors to anyone at this elite hospital. The head facilities director instantly shoved on administrative leave, pending review. They rebuilt that sealed intensive care ventilation system from scratch, adding completely new air quality monitoring. Hunting for the tiny microfractures and toxic seepage that the top-tier doctors and their old systems never even checked. She also wrote me a letter, not an email. A handwritten note on her very own personal stationery. It was addressed straight to James Carter, dropped right into the hospital's environmental services. The department lost its mind before someone quietly slipped the envelope into my locker. In it, she thanked me. She apologized, not for herself but for that hostel room and those arrogant doctors. You and I know those rooms, designed to dismiss a maintenance guy before I even spoke. She admitted she knew a letter couldn't magically undo what had already gone down. But she needed to express her gratitude in a way that actually required real effort. Something that cost her time, not just tossing around the cheap currency of talk. She also included an offer. She had personally contacted a pediatric respiratory director at a major healthcare facility in the city. My daughter Emily had been quietly reviewed through back channels. Channels she didn't explain or apologize for using. She found a specialist there, one of the country's absolute top authorities on childhood airway conditions. This expert was fully prepared to take Emily as a patient, totally free of charge, for as long as she needed care. I read that letter at my kitchen table while Emily ate cereal across from me, her feet happily swinging under her chair, babbling about something from school, involving a fuzzy caterpillar and a massively dramatic misunderstanding. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along the exact creases and set it near my coffee cup. I called the CEO's office the next morning. Her assistant connected me instantly. Charlotte had obviously left strict instructions for my call. "I'll accept the medical arrangement for my Emily," I told her when she picked up. "Good," she replied. "Now the advisory position." I paused. "I really don't think I'm the right guy for that. I know equipment, I know mechanical systems. I don't know how to sit in corporate board meetings and spout opinions." Dead silence. Then she said, "I wasn't thinking of boardroom meetings. I was picturing you walking a facility and actually observing what's wrong before a patient gets hurt." I stayed quiet for a moment. "That I can do." "I know," she whispered, and it began carefully. "You've probably been there, starting carefully when both of you are used to keeping heavy walls up. The top doctors missed everything, but I watched the billionaire arrive as James finished his shift, supposedly for a chat with our facilities boss about updating the hospital vents. Instead, I watched her talk with James for 20 minutes by my service entrance. They leaned against the brick in the spring cold, just chatting about air quality, handling systems, then James's daughter Emily getting better, and then, well, about nothing at all. You know the look when folks just don't want to walk away. The untreatable patient came back the next week and the week after. She never announced these visits. She never gave a reason for them. Charlotte Sinclair always had a flawless, boardroom-ready reason for every single move she ever made in her wealthy life. But I noticed she never wanted to explain this specific habit. She just showed up, and James never asked why she kept coming back. My buddy James was never the type to pry into other people's personal business. But he definitely noticed. He saw how her stiff posture changed a little whenever she arrived, that CEO rigidity melting away bit by bit while they stood there. He saw her listen to him talk about Emily with a focus that wasn't polite, but entirely real. The heavy attention of a sick woman genuinely invested in something, who hasn't quite figured out what to actually do with those feelings. Then came a late April Saturday. I spotted the billionaire at the little park near our hospital. James was already there, parked on a bench while little Emily ran loops around the stone fountain with this unexplainable, totally stubborn focus. The sick CEO sat beside him without asking, close enough that James clearly felt her presence, but not quite close enough to make it weird. Emily was raised by a quiet man, so she really knew how to read a room. I watched her slow her run right as she passed their bench. She studied the sick woman, then glanced at her dad. Then she stared right back at Charlotte, with the blunt gaze of a kid who hasn't learned to hide her staring yet. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Charlotte answered. "Are you my dad's friend?" Charlotte weighed that question with the heavy respect it demanded. "I think so," she said. "I am working on it." That answer worked for Emily. She went right back to running. Let's pause here. James just watched his kids staying completely silent. It was the kind of quiet you never need to fill. Not an empty void, but a living, breathing thing between them. Warm and easy, Charlotte watched Emily too. She studied how the fading sun hit the splashing fountain water, how the spray caught the golden light and scattered it across the dry gray pavement. I could see it right then. She wasn't stressing over her mystery illness, corporate profits, or the lonely fortress of a life she had, carefully built so she would never depend on a single soul permanently. She was simply watching a happy child run through the sunshine. I saw the truth hit her, a sharp, undeniable realization from a dying woman who never took things lightly. For the first time in forever, she wasn't alone. But she never said a word. "You and I know the doctors missed this, I just observe." She wasn't ready to speak, and James didn't push. I watched from my car as she stayed until sunset. Little Emily eventually tired out, climbing right into her father's arms. She fell asleep against his shoulder, showing that pure, absolute trust only a completely safe child ever possesses. My billionaire boss finally stood, pulling her heavy coat tight, speaking softly. Same time next week. James just looked up at her over his sleeping daughter's head. His gaze held that exact same calm. Those unhurried eyes that noticed her trembling hands in intensive care. Stick with me here. This man sees the truth clearly and refuses to be scared. Same time, he simply replied. I opened the car door. She had that specific look. Someone who just agreed to an unnamed deal, yet to her total surprise felt absolutely zero regret. The city traffic swirled around us in its usual indifferent rush. But sitting in the back seat, she seemed entirely different to me, visibly lighter. Lighter than the crushing, mysterious illness she dragged into that intensive care room 2 weeks ago. Not because her sickness magically vanished overnight, but simply because, for the very first time in years of failing medical treatments, she was no longer fighting alone.